right, thanks, guys. Good morning, everybody. If you got a Bible, you can turn to Hebrews 13. Finally there, getting the last chapter. Don't get too excited, still take a few weeks, but we're there, finally. Hey, before I get going, where's Dom at? Or maybe Jim, I don't know. It's a purse, but it's a bag, but it's only got one strap. I don't know what you call those. Someone left one in the lobby, and we have that, so I don't know. It's already... Okay, it's been taken care of. All right, cool. So that's good to know. Whew. All right, so we are, gosh, how many weeks are we in now? A lot, 20-some. All right, so we are well into this book, coming into the final stretch. But as we do that, let me just, again, I want us to remember what this book is about, because as we're coming to it, again, it is so easy for us because we do sermons in chunks, right? No one would want to listen to how long it would take to preach through an entire book of the Bible in one sitting, okay? We can all agree on that. But this letter was, whether it was a letter or a sermon, it was delivered to a congregation for a purpose. And so, if we just engage in the chunks and forget the whole picture, we miss part of what this is trying to do. And I like to say it a lot, but when we miss what the Scriptures are trying to do in us, we end up doing something with them. And so you've got to remember that this congregation, that this letter or sermon was delivered to, is a group of people, some of whom, maybe not all of them, probably not all of them, but some of whom are struggling with the fact that Jesus and their faith has not lived up to their expectations. Right? That they had a certain understanding of what would happen when they came to follow the Messiah, because they had read their Bibles, and they had read them in a certain way that told them that when God comes to right the world, and he does it through this individual, that what's going to happen is this new world is going to come on the scene. And when that new world comes on the scene, their sin's going to be taken care of and dealt with. Justice will reign. Peace will be everywhere. And everything, and they will be vindicated, not just before God, but before everybody, as the people of the true God. And then Tuesday happens. Right? And suddenly they're still wrestling with their sin, and they're being oppressed by the Romans, and they're struggling in their marriages, and it's just, life is hard, and maybe this isn't the guy. Maybe he's not the guy. None of us have ever struggled there, so really this letter has nothing to do with us, right? And so the first the vast majority of this book, the vast majority of this letter is dealing with who Jesus is and the glory that he came to bring. And then it engages in the fact that as we walk with him, our understanding, our experience of faith, this thing of I have this now experience of yes, Jesus is with me, and I have these overwhelming moments of I've got joy and I've got victory and I'm seeing change. And then we have these other moments in the midst of it, this not yet side that's very angsty. I'm still struggling. I still fight with my spouse. I still fight with my kids. I still struggle in my work, and everything feels futile at times, and I just don't know what to do, and I still deal with a restlessness in my soul, and what is going on? And Hebrews is telling us, especially in chapter 11, guess what? That's normal. That's the way it's always been. And so chapter 12, then, that being the case, press on. And now we come to 13. What does that look like practically? Okay? So we're in the first 6 verses of chapter 13. If you stand in honor of God's word, we'll get right into this. Hear this. Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you're also in the body. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Keep your life free from the love of money. Be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? This is the word of the Lord. Would you pray with me? Father, have mercy on us this morning. There is so much just in those 6 verses that can trigger us and distract us, maybe even confirm everything we've always feared about Christianity. Or the opposite, that it's just so blah that we'll check out. We need you to come in and to enliven our hearts. Help us to hear this anew. Help us to see in the midst of it our Savior Jesus, who is for us our life, our vindication, and our power as we go about our days. And we ask all this in Christ's name. Amen. Have a seat. You know, I would imagine if you and I were in Galilee in the first century, Galilee is the kind of the extreme northern portion of what we call Israel, that if we were in Galilee in the first century and came across this wandering phenomenon called Jesus, that we would be just as confused as everybody else was. And I think that because if you were to listen to most churches, they tend to emphasize one aspect of his ministry and kind of relegate the rest. It's like we can kind of get him if we just hold on to one piece. But if we try and hold too much together, it's just like, I don't know, whatever. All right, let's go with this. Here's what I mean. Maybe a simple, easy one. See, on the one hand, Jesus preached this and embodied this kind of radical acceptance, right? This radical acceptance of those who followed him, no matter what their life was like before they came to him. It was grace upon grace. And that's why he attracted so many that the culture had written off. People that were nothing like him followed him. They were nothing like him, but man, did they like him. And you have churches that focus on that, right? They focus on that kind of radical acceptance and just all of that. And it's true. But on the other hand, he taught this radical life of holiness. And it recasts sin as not just something we do, not just something we do with our hands, but something that we are, something that's in our hearts. And you have churches like that too, right? But the New Testament can talk about this fairly easily. It holds these two together with this concept of freedom. It's freedom. And not just freedom from something. It is that. Like on the one hand, we have been freed from the penalty of our betrayal of God, our guilt. We've been freed from some need to kind of achieve and to do all that thing. But we've also been freed from the power of that betrayal, from the power of that sin over us. And that means that not only have we been freed from something, but we've been freed for something. And that's what we come to this week. For 12 chapters of talking about who Jesus is and who we are as followers of him. Now we get into what it's supposed to look like. And ultimately, it looks like a life of love. There's outlines if you'd like to take notes. That it's in your worship guide, but if not, just stick with me, okay? So let's just jump into this. So nearly every scholar, if you were to read them, and I don't necessarily recommend that unless you're of that type. If not, you're just going to get bored, honestly. They're not exactly engaging authors, most of them. Smart, just not engaging. But nearly every scholar will tell you that we are entering into a section of moral teaching, what they call, and you can say this if you want to impress your friends, paranesis. Ooh, okay? That'll go over well at a cocktail party, all right? So these 6 verses 1 to 6, they contain what I would call 4 couplets, like 4 pairings of different things that go together, and they're meant to go together. And so let's look at that first one. Look down at verses 1 and 2. Let brotherly love continue. It's a great verse, very short. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. Okay, we'll get to the angels thing in a second. Now, as you read this, it doesn't really seem like these go together, do they? right? Like brotherly love. And yes, that is the word from which our city in Pennsylvania gets its name. It doesn't embody it very well, but it does get the name there. Okay? All right, so brotherly love and hospitality don't seem like they go together. But in the original, in the language that this letter was written in, it's actually based on the same word. It's brotherly love, and hospitality is the word for love of stranger. Right? Philadelphia, Philoxenia. Same words. Or not same words, but you get the picture. You know what I'm trying to say there. And so there is a connection between the two. Now, here's where they also connect. When you and I hear brotherly love, we think of affection, don't we? Unless you have brothers. Okay? You don't really think of affection. You think of toleration, all right? But we think of affection, and that's because that word love for us has been hijacked by this philosophical movement that we call romanticism. Right? But you have to remember that came long after the Bible was written. In the Bible, love isn't simply an affection. It's an action. It's a posture. Okay? It's tangible. It means care for, sharing with, seeking the flourishing of. It's not simply just getting a warm fuzzy. There's actually work to do in it. And so brotherly love means caring for, seeking the flourishing of brothers. And specifically in the Christian context, that means other Christians. With me so far? So on the one hand, the command is to continue caring for one another in the church, which is to say that the church isn't simply supposed to be a social club where you hang out once a week with some people who kind of think similar things in you. It's supposed to be a community of mutual concern. Me caring for you, you caring for me, caring for one another, right? Where the very life of this community is meant to be a foretaste of the new world that God is making. That's what it's meant to be. I'm not saying we do it great. I'm just saying that's what it's supposed to be. And see, some churches do that really well. In fact, I would argue that most of us, that's kind of our default, is it not? If it's not look out for me, it's at very least look out for my tribe. Let me look out for those that are most like me. If we're going to care for anyone, if we're going to help anyone feel like they belong, it's the insiders of our group, right? And that's why he says to let that continue. In other words, he doesn't feel like he has to command that. He just says, hey, keep this up. It's really short. But then he says, in the midst of that, don't neglect the love of the stranger either. In other words, hospitality is extending that kind of care and concern beyond the insider to the outsider. It's extending that same kind of mentality of we're all in this together beyond just us and to others that are outside of us. So let me get really practical here, right? Extending hospitality, showing hospitality to strangers can be as simple as helping those who come through our doors on a Sunday morning feel like they belong. Maybe inviting them to sit with you, introducing yourself, getting to know them, helping them find their way around, just being welcoming, hospitable, help people feel as at home as they can. It could be opening our homes and having neighbors over for dinner or having visitors at church over for lunch. The point is that what we're doing is extending that sphere of care outside of our tribe and into the lives of those who aren't part of it, giving them a taste of that new world. It means sharing resources. It means opening our lives to others. So that's the first one. Brotherly love and hospitality. The second one is care for the forgotten. Look down at verse 3. Remember those who are in prison I never talked about the angels. Let me get back to that. Some of you are like, yeah, that's all I cared about in that verse. Listen, almost every time the writer of Hebrews kind of drops some kind of bomb like that, he's referring back to some other place in Scripture. And in the stories that made up the Old Testament, that was something that happened several times, right? In Abraham's life, that happened. Like, guys would show up and he's like, hey, welcome, I don't know who you are, but come in, share a meal, do all this stuff. And it turns out they were angelic visitors. He's giving that as a kind of listen, This isn't out of the realm of possibility. Some, not meaning some in their community, but some historically have had that happen, okay? All right, now let's jump into the care for the forgotten. So look down at verse 3. Remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated since you are also in the body. Now, it would be very easy for us to hear this in a way that it wasn't intended because of our situation versus the situation of those who first heard it. So let me remind us a little bit about life in the first century. First off, for those in this church, for those in that congregation that are being spoken to, there are probably some who are either imprisoned currently or would be because of their faith. That's the context. In other words, this is not talking about prison ministry per se. Okay, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, just saying it's not what this is talking about. It is about those who are part of the church who are in prison. Okay, so why is that such a big deal? Well, being in prison in the first century basically meant that you were chained to a wall with no one to care for you. Right? Like the prison guards didn't bring you your 3 squares a day. You weren't kind of like made sure that your cot was there and it was clean. There was no caring for prisoners. They were just locked up. So if you were going to get care, if you were going to get food, someone had to bring it to you. Someone you knew had to bring it to you. If you were going to be warm when it was cold, someone was going to have to bring you your cloak, like the Apostle Paul asks for in 2 Timothy when he writes to his friend and says, hey, please bring my cloak with you. I would imagine it was a little chilly for him. He needed warmth. Someone has to do this. In other words, these are people that were isolated and could not care for themselves, and they were part of the church. And then he mentions those who were mistreated. That could be because they were beaten. That happened. It could be because they'd had their property taken. That happened. As a matter of fact, we're told that happened in Hebrews itself. It's a very broad word, this word mistreated. And so in the first situation, he says to remember them, remember those that are in prison as if you also were in prison. In other words, hey, remember what it would be like and take care of them, remembering that they don't have anybody. And in the second, he says to do this because you are also in the body. Now, the first one makes sense, right? Because it's like solidarity. Feel solidarity. We're all about that. The second, though, I think we take as meaning be with those who are mistreated because you have a body too, and remember that you can feel pain. Scholars, though, will tell you that this is more likely pointing to the fact that you are part of the body, as in the church, and so are they. In other words, both of these are pointing to those that are easily forgotten in the church community. Part of the church community, but can't be a part of the church community for one reason or another. If they're in prison, they're out of sight. And listen, you got your own concerns going on, right? Your schedules are busy. You visit people. There's lots going on. Somebody else will get to that. If they've been mistreated, well, now it would be very easy for you not to associate with them, right? Because you don't want that coming on you. I'll just kind of keep my distance. But what's being said here is that you and I, as part of the church, are with them. We are with them because we are one body. So in our context, it might not be prisoners. I don't know of anyone who's a member of UPC is currently serving time. Not saying that can't happen. Just saying I don't think that's the case right now. But it could be shut-ins. Could be those who are dealing with sickness. Could be those who found themselves in a place in life where it's very difficult just to get out of bed. I've been there. Maybe you have too. Will we care for them? It is those who can't be a part of the life of the church, but they are still the church. Are we going to care for them? Or is it just like, I haven't seen so-and-so for a while. All right, now we come to the hot button one, right? Look down at verse 4. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. For For God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. All right, there are a number of things in this that are going to trigger us. Let's just be honest. I would probably argue that it should be challenging for all of us, but we'll get to that. Let's just name them, right? Okay, first, it talks about judgment. Judgment's hard. Most of us don't really like the idea. Even if you're like a convinced Christian, it's one of those things you're like, yeah, I'd rather not think about that. But it doesn't just talk about judgment. It says that God will judge the sexually immoral and the adulterous. And that hits us funny because it's unique to that command, right? Like, why doesn't he say God will, show hospitality to strangers because God will judge the inhospitable? No, he just leaves it on this one, which it just confirms everything that we were suspicious of about Christianity in the first place, right? Why say that here and not anywhere else? Well, there's actually a really good reason for that. See, you and I tend to think that the Bible was written in Puritan New England, or better yet, Hawthorne's version of Puritan New England, right? Which was not Puritan New England, by the way. Spoiler alert. But actually, the first century Roman Empire was an insanely sexual place. It was incredibly sexual. It was so sexualized that this new group called Christians had this thing they did every week that the Romans assumed had to have been a sex party because they called it a love feast. We now call it communion. They were just like, love feast? I know what's going on there. Because it was their presupposition. It was so present in the culture that is what they thought. So the biblical sexual ethic was actually more out of place in the Roman Empire than it is even in America today. In other words, he has to say this because it would have been weird. It would have been like, yeah, I get it, but this is just how you do life. No, it's not. So how does he describe it? Well, first he says that marriage is to be honored by all. So what we need to understand about this is that he gives two commands, marriage be held and honored by all, and then this thing about the marriage bed that we'll get to. And then he gives a reason in the second half of the verse. And if the second half of the verse is the reason for those first two things, then that has to be what influences the rest of it, okay? And so we need to understand that when he's talking about these two things, he's talking about sexuality. When he says that marriage is to be held and honored by all, he doesn't just mean think a lot about marriage. Think it's a really good thing. Like, he's speaking specifically about sexuality within marriage. And so to honor marriage in this context means to be true to your vows sexually. It means to not be expressing your sexuality outside of the relationship between your husband or your wife, right? And then he says this thing about the marriage bed. That is a very, very polite way of saying something, okay? That word marriage bed is the same word that we have now that kind of speaks to the actual act of sex. And so, of course, our translators, to try and be polite, call it the marriage bed, okay? It can mean that, but it's only by implication. It means the act itself. And so he says to keep it undefiled. So what does that mean? Well, the reason he gives should inform what he means. He lists two things. Again, sexual immorality and adultery. What does it mean to defile that? Well, sexual immorality, biblically, means, and listen, I know this is hard, but listen, we got to get this. It means any kind of sexual expression, any expression of your sexuality outside of the covenant relationship between a husband and wife. Any. And that's obviously something you can do whether you're married or not. Honoring marriage can only be done while you're married. But defiling your sexuality is something that can happen regardless. And then, of course, he says the adulteress. Well, adultery is obviously a sexual relationship with someone who is not your spouse. And so it gets into it. It defiles. That's another really religious term that sounds just shaming. What does it mean? Well, it means this. It defiles it. It makes it, it changes it because it's not what God made it for, right? When God gives these commands, it's not to ruin our fun. And sometimes it seems like that, but that's not what it's for. It's because sex was created by God to be a kind of physical representation of what marriage was meant to be. Two people completely vulnerable with one another, delighting in and being delighted in by each other. It's meant to be the pinnacle of a whole life sharing. That sharing of a whole life that happens in marriage. And to express this outside of that life sharing is to say, I don't want your life, I just want your body. I don't want to give myself for you and to love you, I just want to use you. And that is antithetical to everything Christianity speaks of. So why does he point out that God will judge this? Because the idea that we would just kind of use one another's bodies would have been totally normal in first century Roman Empire. Totally normal. Just like, yeah, I mean, that's what I do. I have slaves, that's what they're for. I've got this temple down the street, that's what it's for. It's what we do. It's basically him saying, look, I know that hooking up and using others is totally normal in this culture, but it is antithetical to the gospel. You're like, well, why didn't he have to say that to everything else? Because hospitality was actually a cultural value, right? In the ancient Near East, in first century Rome, like hospitality, bringing in the that's a cultural value. It's like, oh, that's what we're supposed to do as a culture. He didn't have to talk about it. So he moves on. Lastly, as we would expect, after he deals with sex, he deals with money. Look down at verse 5. Keep your life free from love of money, and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Now, when you and I talk about love of money, we tend to think of those that have a lot, right? It's like that Scrooge kind of image of someone just counting their coins over and over. Or if you're a child of the 90s like me, it's the Scrooge McDuck image, swimming through the money bin, okay? DuckTales, look it up, YouTube it, all right? Great show. But love isn't about what you have. Love is about where your loyalty lies. The call to be free from the love of money is about not giving it your loyalty, not serving it, not seeing it as the goal of your life, seeing it as that which keeps you safe, makes you worthy, or keeps you satisfied. And so he follows that up with this call to be contentment. In other words, to be satisfied in what you have. And the reason for these is this quote from this Old Testament book in Joshua. And it gets to the heart of why we give our love, why we give our loyalty to money, right? For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. The only reason that can speak to our love of money is because that is what drives our love of money. The fear of being forsaken. The fear of being abandoned. Okay, but let's be honest. None of us really think we have a problem here, do we? Right? I mean, I don't love money, Rick. How could I? I don't have that much. Well, let me give you some possible telltale signs it could be a problem for you. It probably doesn't apply. One, if tithing to the local church is something that you said you would do when you get just a little more money. In other words, if the amount stifles your willingness to be generous, you may have a little more love of money than you think. If you spend more than you have because you have to keep up your lifestyle no matter the circumstances, your love may be with your money. Maybe. If you work insane hours to give your family the life that you never had, your love may be with your money. And if your anxiety level is inversely proportional to the level of your bank account, your love may be with your money. There are others, but that should do for now. Again, I'm sure it doesn't apply to any of us. See, God is calling us to realize in the midst of this that mentality doesn't have so much to do with how much or how little we have, but from the fear The fear that we are alone and uncared for. That's where it comes from. Because the idea that I will never leave you nor forsake you has anything to do with my drive to get more stuff. The only reason that could have to do with the other is because this drive comes from that fear. And here's the reality. It is almost impossible to love both the insiders and the outsiders, the very first thing that was asked, if we give our loyalty, if we give our love to our money. Okay? All right. I want to bring this home this morning by talking about two things. Because this passage is asking for change in us. And if I know anything about us and I know anything about change, it's this. We don't change until the pain of change is less than the pain of staying the same. We just don't. So I want to talk first about the cost of what this is. Because all of this, all of it, can really be summed up by the idea of love. We're to love our fellow Christians. We're to love those that aren't Christians. We're to love the forgotten. We're to love others by honoring theirs and our sexuality. And we're to love and trust the Lord to take care of us. But love costs. It always does. It always does. And the reality is, the reason that we don't do it is because you and I don't want to pay the cost. See, we don't want to love our brother. We don't want to love our fellow Christian. Honestly, we do when it's easy, but we don't want to do that when it's hard, because that means putting aside our pride and our preferences and our prerogatives. We push them to the side to seek that person's flourishing. And if we do that, who's going to take care of me? Right? We don't want to love the stranger because it opens us to risk. It takes our time away. Even something as simple as welcoming and being hospitable towards someone in here on Sunday morning. Well, then I don't get the time to talk to my friends and have my worship experience and to have what I want. We don't want to love the forgotten because they can't reciprocate. They have very little to offer. And frankly, if we spend too much time with them, maybe we get forgotten too. We don't want to honor sexuality. We don't want to stop looking at pornography or cut off relationships that we shouldn't be pursuing. Saying no to ourselves because it has become the only way we know how to deal with life. And we don't want to give up on money because we're afraid that's the only thing that can make us safe or make us somebody. It costs too much. You see the connection? All of it is driven by this fear that we will not be taken care of. All of it is driven by the idea that we have to take care of ourselves, and we only have so much ability to do that. It's a zero-sum game. It's a fixed pie. And if I give over here, that's less that I'm getting. And that's the way we see the world. And so long as we continue to believe that, so long as we continue to live into that, we will be enslaved to those things. You and I will never be free to love. And that's why these verses end the way they do. See, oftentimes I think people read verse 6 as just related to verse 5, but I actually think it's extended to all of them. I think it's extended to all of them. So let me read it. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? All right, so that's from Psalm 118. In case you're wondering, you can go back and read that a little later. And remember what we said over and over again in this series. When the book of Hebrews is quoting a verse out of the Old Testament, these aren't people who have their Bibles who can go look it up later. If he's quoting it, he's expecting them to know it, and by knowing it, he means know the whole thing. Right? So that one verse would have brought to mind all of Psalm 118. And this is incredibly important because the verse right before the one he quoted says this: out of my distress, I called to the Lord. The Lord answered me, and he set me free. Now, here's why this passage speaks to the whole problem. This fear of feeling like I need to take care of me, this is not new. This isn't something Americans developed. It's not like we created that, Westerners even. This goes all the way back to the garden. It comes from that very state that we entered into when, at the beginning, we betrayed God and turned from him. See, we betrayed him in the garden because we believed a lie that though we were made to be dependent on him, that we not only could be independent from him, but had to be, because he wasn't really true to what he said. He really wouldn't take care of us. He really wasn't faithful. And so we betrayed him, and when we did, we all by nature became stuck in that lie. That nature of being independent of God. That's where all of these things that we call sin come from. All of it. All of it comes from the assumption, the presupposition, that we can be, and in fact we must be, independent of God. But these verses tell of God's solution. I called upon the Lord, and he answered me. He's called the Lord. That's God's covenant name. And God's covenant name brings with it a story, because it's only what God's covenant people called him. And that story is the one where God, right when we betrayed him, promised to fix everything. And the whole Bible tells this story, and it ends up working itself out, coming to fulfillment in the work of Jesus, that Jesus lived perfectly and died sacrificially and rose victoriously to deliver us ultimately from ourselves. And so when we place our faith in him, we're united to him. What's true of him becomes true of us. Our betrayal is dealt with in his sin-bearing death. His perfectly dependent life becomes ours before the Father. And we are made new in his resurrection to leave that lie behind us. We're set free. We're set free. So verse 6 says, the Lord, again, that covenant name, is my helper. And that word is so beautiful because it speaks to someone that you depend on. The one that we depend on for help. All the things that hold us back from loving are answered right there. The Lord is my helper. Who will look out for me? Him. Who will take care of my needs? Him. Who will soothe my soul when I can't deal with life? Him. That is how we are set free. That is how we are freed from ourselves for someone else. So we're not just set free from the penalty of sin, from the pressure that some of us feel to living up to a standard. We're also freed from that bondage of sin, the bondage to us. We don't have to look out for number one anymore because he has given us everything in Jesus. That is the power to love. You can't white-knuckle this. It doesn't come from you. It doesn't come from your ability to work up affection from others. It comes from the conviction that everything we need has already been given to us. And if Jesus has already given us everything, then there is nothing that anything else can give us. Would you pray with me? So, Lord, in light of that, we ask that you would free us, even this morning. Free us to love. Free us to love our brothers and sisters. Free us to love the strangers, even those among us right now. We confess that we don't often do that. We're so stuck on ourselves. We're all there, Lord. Help us. Lord, free us to remember the forgotten. Free us to honor the ways in you have made us, even sexually. And free us from our need, our feelings that we need to keep ourselves safe or make us somebody or keep us satisfied with our money. Free us in the gospel, because only Jesus can free.